Your connectedness to family, community, and culture is more predictive of your mental health than your history of adversity. That's one of my favorite points I took from What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. It's a powerful reminder for us as coaches and parents. I think we are so often afraid of adversity and the struggle, and we try to protect our kids from this struggle and adversity, that we can let that fear become our only focus. When we as coaches and even parents, we probably need to be putting more focus on investing in relationships and supporting others in the struggle. I'm so excited to be back today with Dr. Bruce Perry and Megan Bartlett. Obviously, as coaches and parents, we want to take mental health seriously. It's becoming more and more of an issue. In my experience, not just for our athletes or our children, but for ourselves. The last couple of years has really taken its toll on all of us. Reading this book, What Happened to You, came for me at a very important time in my life. I started to read it about a year ago. We were in another lockdown here in Ireland where I live with my family. And if I was honest, I was really struggling. This book was the message I needed and the information that I needed to take some steps forward personally, as well as in some relationships with some important family members that I was struggling with. And it really helped me as a person who struggles with empathy. I think it really helped me to improve in that quality of empathy with a lot of really important people in my life. Anyways, today's episode is another great one. We start off by talking about probably what many listeners were concerned with after listening to last episode. And that is, for me, it's this concern that I have of being too soft as a leader, like almost overly concerned and sensitive to mental health issues and the potential damage that could potentially cause. I hope that makes sense. Dr. Bruce Perry does a great job of discussing that. Welcome back to the Coaching Culture Podcast. I'm JP Nurbin, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host Nate Sanderson. This is the podcast where we talk about becoming a better leader and building a better culture. We've got quite the range of guests on the podcast, as you see in today's episode with Dr. Perry, the world's leading trauma researcher, and Megan Bartlett, who has spent a lot of hours working with people in sport to help them use research like Dr. Perry's to improve our coaching so we can more positively impact athletes.
I guess one of the other pushbacks, I wouldn't even say pushbacks, because I myself and many of the coaches that I support, we're all really trying to be super intentional in how we do this. But I think there's a bit of worry and concern we have around, I don't want to say being too soft, but like this idea that like, well, they're too fragile. And then all of a sudden we're walking on eggshells around kids and trying to accept this reality of like doing hard things and going through hard shit is good for you sometimes in the sense, at what point as a culture are we being overcautious or is that even possible?
Well, it's absolutely possible. We see it all the time. We see people that are either as parents or even mental health professionals, they're afraid of, the harm that they're going to do for their child. They're going to be too nervous, too anxious. There are people that literally have attacked me because I haven't put testing in a category as a trauma. So that there's groups of parents that believe any kind of testing is traumatic for children and nobody should be tested. And again, we have that term, that helicopter parent. People are familiar with that. It's okay for kids to skin their knee and to climb and to fall down and break. I don't want them to break a bone, but it's not the worst thing that ever happened. People never learn skills unless they practice. And that means you have to leave your comfort zone and you have to go out and be challenged. The key to being challenged, though, is if you have somebody there who can basically catch you if you fall. Relationally supported challenges are really, really good for people. And I think sport is one of the greatest ways to do that. There's coaches there. There are coaches there that should be able to be your relational support when you get challenged. And you can challenge in a lot of different ways. I mean, you can challenge by getting kids to try to run a little bit further or swim a little bit faster, or see if you can do one more, or let's do 10 more free throws, or those are not, they're a little bit of, there are ways to challenge people that maintain the elements that Megan's talking about of predictability, of moderation in stress, as opposed to extreme or prolonged stress.
This idea that like love and high expectations are mutually exclusive is really detrimental, really, sort of, and this happens to me all the time. Like I'm the youth development person, right? Like I'm the youth development coach. I'm the coach who's going to make you understand your kids, right? And that's somehow soft. It helps when you can say you're doing it based on neuroscience, right? That makes it a little less soft. But generally, I think this idea that, to Bruce's point about like being a relational safety net for kids, is not actually soft, right? We have this idea that relationships are soft, but that through creating the relationship actually allows you to push kids harder, actually allows you to challenge kids to do more in a way that they're going to grow more, they're going to learn more, they're going to be more resilient to when they do, when it is, Nate, they blow the lead and they have to come back in overtime and get regulated and perform the way that they're meant to perform. That's a real challenge, right? It's not that we don't want kids to have that challenge. Of course we do. They were able to do it because of the relationship with you.
Exactly.
And that's not soft at all.
Not so, and the beauty of that story is that you've clearly done things like that with them previously, right? There have been times when you sort of calm them down, right? All right, you're not getting it. If people are having a bad day, let's reset, right? You probably said that a million times, working on something. And they felt you and they got regulated and they then performed the way they could. But that's a reflection of relational connection. And you probably feel like you love those girls. I mean, you worked with them for some of them for 4 years, right? It was a special night for them, and you calm them down. And that's kind of what we're talking about. That you can have both. You can have I expect you guys to perform at a high level and destroy these guys in 4 minutes. But I also understand that you're all stirred up, and I'm going to do what is required to calm them down.
One of the words that keeps getting thrown around here, and you hear this a lot, is that word regulation. And I don't know if coaches, I mean, that's not something in a common coaching vernacular of, you don't go to a clinic and say, here are the strategies for regulating my athletes, right? So, or regulating myself for that matter. So when it comes to just that idea of regulation, can you give us a little bit more, maybe a better understanding of what that means? And then you've mentioned a lot of things like the relationships and the consistency. I know environment's an important part of it. Rhythm is a way of regulation, but maybe some other tips for coaches when they're working with a dysregulated athlete, just some strategies for them as well.
Well, let me talk about a couple simple things, and and coaches will cue in on this right away. But first of all, regulation. Your whole body we have hundreds of systems. You have a system that controls the way you get oxygen into your blood, your respiratory system. You have systems that control how blood cells flow through your body. You have systems that regulate your sleep and waking cycles. You have systems that regulate, how much glucose you have. And so all these systems are working with a certain rhythm. And so when you get out of this narrow range of acceptable activity, let's take food, for example, that you don't eat for 6 hours, all of a sudden the amount of sugar you have available for your muscles to work drops, and you get dysregulated. You're out of this homeostatic space. So you have to do something that will regulate yourself. So you eat, and you get back into regulation. Let's do something else that's common in sport. Let's say that you start doing sprints. and you burn up a lot of oxygen, and you take deeper breaths and more frequent breaths, that you're dysregulated when you are huffing and puffing. And now you can widen the range of your homeostatic capability for cardiorespiratory conditioning through practice, pattern, repetitive, rhythmic stuff. This is why we do intervals and high intensity reps and all that kind of stuff. That changes the physiology, but there still is sort of a point at which you run too far, too fast, don't have enough oxygen, and you got to get back into equilibrium. That's when we raise your hand and they pull you off the field, and you get 60 seconds to breathe oxygen before you go back on. You're back in, you're regulated. You would never leave a dysregulated, exhausted lineman in because they're not going to be able to run very fast, and they're not going to be able to perform at a high level. So they have to be regulated. Now so all of these systems in your body work together to create sort of a collective sense of regulation. And if your athletes come to practice hungry, they're not going to do as well. So it's important that they are eating the right things. If they come sleep deprived, they're not going to perform as well. If they're ill and they've been pushed, their body temperature is getting pushed out of equilibrium, it's going to change the way they perform. So there's a lot of these regulatory systems that have to kind of be in check. It's sort of like going into, AutoZone and, your athletes, and again, those of you who know a lot about sort of high performance athletics, they literally, it is like going to AutoZone. They check your levels, they do all this stuff. They tune you up so that you're at your peak performance capability. And then when you get out and when you perform, you challenge one of these systems, your muscles, your cardiovascular system. You challenge this is why defenses change the look all the time. They're trying to cognitively challenge the quarterback and get him out of equilibrium. And so those things if you can sort of if you've seen a lot of those things and you know what to expect. Tom Brady, the more he plays, the more film he watches, the harder it is to get him out, to dysregulate him and fluster him so his performance will go down because he's seen so much. But if you take a rookie quarterback in there and it takes longer for him to figure out what the defense is, the speed is too fast for him to get back into equilibrium and perform at a high level, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I could go on and on, but regulation is basically having your key systems in your body functioning within a certain range.
So I want to get you out of here on this because I want to respect your time. I know you have to go here, so you could be as quick as you want here. But if you could just wave a wand and bring systemic change across the sporting culture to make it a healthier environment from what you know about the brain, what are you going to do?
I'm going to have all coaches from youth sport level all the way up to professional have opportunity to get basic introduction to these core concepts. And then the interesting thing is once you learn them and you get a few good teachers like Megan help you connect the dots, then it's kind of self-perpetuating, because once you see that that this makes sense, then it's so much easier to kind of look for a little bit more information and want to continue to grow. But I think that introductory touch really is important, and I think it really should be integrated into teaching. If you get formal education as a coach, you should learn a little bit about the brain, and if you don't get formal education as a coach and you get informal training, professional development, I think it should be the first thing that you learn is a little bit about how the brain works and how people work, the stress response, relationships, power differential, all the stuff we've been talking about, and actually, Megan can talk all about how to do that, because she's doing that all around the country, all around the world, actually.
I loved what Bruce said about getting these core concepts in front of people. Really, it's not, you don't have to take we offer a 100-hour course. You don't have to take a 100-hour course. You have to be curious enough about the brain and sort of some of these core concepts to keep thinking about them. That's my opinion, right? I love the course, but I think really what you have to be able to do is say, oh, this is all stuff I was never taught, and it does make a difference in how I show up and how then young people learn from me. We have a coach who did our NM Sport course. His name is Ethan Barron, and he's the head track coach at Williams College. And Ethan's analogy, and I think this to your point, JP, about like if you could wave a magic wand, what wand would you wave? Ethan's point was 30 years ago, and in some cases even more recently than that, not every college program, sport program, not every college athlete also had a weight training program as part of what they did, right? I played soccer in college 20 years ago, and I didn't really have an organized weight training program. I was a college athlete that didn't get the same kind of attention to my full sort of physical development that athletes get today. And Ethan's point is like, this is that for the next wave of athletes, right? Like if you don't understand these core concepts, there's this idea that athletes have changed, right? Kids today are different. No, the world today is different, right? And so it's not the kids' fault. They're not different. They are reflective of an environment that's different. And it's so important for coaches to be able to keep up with that, in my opinion. And this is one of the ways they can do that.
And I love that because I think so often, and when it comes to mental performance, like we've come at it from the application of the practical and the visualization without having a real general understanding of actually the mental side, the brain, right? Which I think is huge. I guess I'm going to ask this question here, and then I know Nate's going to jump in with some more stuff here, but kind of around this idea of systemic change, you and where you operate, I'd be curious your perspective on the responsibility of administrators and referees and club organization, or just organizations in general, these governing bodies, when it comes to the protection of athletes. Do you think that there is kind of a role for them to play when it comes to not just how our coach talks to a referee, but how a coach talks to another player of the other team, but their own players? Is there like a responsibility? Is there an argument to be made for that?
100%. Yeah, I think absolutely. I think one of the biggest challenges in sport at every level is just a lack of accountability, right? Who is holding a coach accountable for not traumatizing a young person, right? And as we're watching in real time, this movement towards more athlete-centered policies, practices, athletes standing up for themselves in ways that they've never been able to, athletes standing up against their own exploitation or abuse in ways they've never been able to before. Part of what's allowed that to happen for so long, in my opinion, is that nobody holds coaches accountable. And for a long time, and in lots of ways, I think there's no governing body of sport really that does that, right? The USOPC exists in a way that doesn't have anything to do with AAU basketball or have anything to do with USYSA soccer. And there are just so many disparate places where sport is administered that have no connection to each other and no roll up to any body, that it's really hard to say this is how, that there's no way to mandate behavior or certifications or training or anything on a system level, because you can make sure that a state high school association does one thing, and then there's 50 states. You can make sure that the NCAA could hypothetically do something for all college coaches. I haven't seen that, so there's just not the kind of accountability in sport or systems in place to do that. But I firmly believe that from a athlete experience perspective, you're only as good as the worst coach in your league. Right. So Nate, you can protect your girls from a lot. You can't protect them from everything. right? You can't protect them from the potential to be totally dysregulated by the behavior of another adult who is screaming at their own kids or screaming at your kids, right? And if we really want to create thriving environments for kids, then it requires at least basic modifications of all of the adults in the who are part of the puzzle.
Yeah, and I think that's what I really appreciate about your work, though, is I think, I don't know if we're going to be changing any governing bodies at this stage, but you're coming in and educating coaches, and I think one area is providing a safer environment by kind of educating how these behaviors are unhealthy. But then the other end of that is not every coach, even the worst ones out there, are ruining people's lives, but they're just missing this huge opportunity, which comes back to so much the positive benefits of sports to create a healing environment. And the reality is, God, all our lives are stressful. We're all going through and coming out, hopefully, the end of this pandemic. Like, everyone's life is stressful, and sport has the potential to be so positive, and that healing community that Perry talks about so much, and what happened to you. So, I'm just kind of curious. You talked about some of the things that you do as far as the education on this, and I'm just kind of curious other ways that you're helping coaches to make this environment more healthy and improve their own coaching.
Well, I think this is something that, so I run a training company, and I think coach training doesn't work. It's not that becoming educated works, but coach training doesn't work. And there's a real difference there. And I think from what I understand about the work that you all do, that's actually very, that's a key part of what we actually want when we're talking about behavior change. So I think ideally what coaching needs, right? If we could wave a wand, Bruce waves a wand and everybody gets some of the basics of these core concepts, I would say part 2, second wand wave, is somebody has somebody to talk to about them. Somebody has somebody who calls them after practice and says, did you do the thing that you wanted to do? What happened when you tried this with this kid? What happened when, it sounds like maybe you got a little dysregulated there. It sounds, like you need that. And in Bruce's book, he and Oprah talk about the healing relationship between Oprah and Gail, and how the dose of that relationship helped create the healing that Oprah, in this case, needed outside of a clinical relationship, right? She's never had therapy. She had Gail. And I think coaches need Gail. Coaches need their Gail, right? They need the person that they can reflect on, that they can choose the dosage of. They can call and say, I only have 2 minutes. They can say, can we actually grab a beer after practice so we can really talk about it? They can sort of, that it's normalized that you have somebody with whom you check in about this work all the time, if we really expect coaches to get better and reflect on and make the changes that we want them to make. So learn the concepts, and then yes, you can sort of implement some of them for yourselves, but ideally you're doing that as part of a community who's also curious, who's also understands that change happens over time and not just because you learned a concept.
Sorry, I don't have a good transition for this, Megan, but this is a question I'm just curious your perspective on, when I think of, if JP gave me the magic wand, and I'm not credentialed to be able to wave it like Dr. Perry, but and I could say, okay, here's one thing I wish that coaches understood about the brain. JP and I more or less used the book, What Happened to You, for kind of our content for the retreat that we did this summer with coaches.
Yeah.
And essentially what I tried to do was to get them to understand that the brain's job is to, as he said, like you're gathering this sensory information and you're trying to detect patterns so that you can predict threats. Like that's the survival mechanism of the brain, right? So one of the things that I, used as an example, and again, taken from the book and even the triangle that he talked about, was I showed a picture of kind of this almost like a professor's office with books strewn everywhere, and there's there's a computer on the desk, and just imagine the messy, professor's office, right?
Sure.
And so if a child walked in there and that was dad, and it was Father's Day, and the child, created this card and put a lot of time in it, and it was the expression of, this is how much I love dad, and I made this thing, and brings it to him in his office, and he turns around and says, I'm too busy to work right now, I can't deal with this, and just lays into the child for interrupting his work time. In that moment of vulnerability, the defense mechanisms are going to take a picture of that environment, and everything in the environment is fair play to be mapped onto sort of the emergency response system.
Yep.
To a potential threat in the future, right? And so now you fast forward 15 years down the road, and they have to go see their college professor about a paper that they didn't write very well, and they walk into the office. That's and right. All of a sudden there's books strewn around, and there's a computer on the desk. It's not the same person, it's not the same books, it's not the same room, but they start to feel anxiety just because of the environment that they can't explain. They don't understand why, right? But that's the function of the brain. It detects a pattern and it triggers a response even before we can rationalize the situation.
Right.
How many times do we walk into that as parents and coaches? I mean, we see it all the time.
Constantly.
And we have absolutely no awareness that in a lot of ways, this is an innocent process. But the kid gets labeled as, Dr. Perry said, they're uncoachable, or they don't work hard, or they don't listen, or they don't give eye contact. And then that skews how we interact with them, how we treat them, how we coach them. And a lot of that just stems from this misunderstanding of the brain's primary function as a survival organ, and then how that plays out in this very different world than the way that it, evolved over the last thousands of years.
No, I mean, that's it exactly. And I think it's a fundamental miss from the understanding perspective for coaches, but for parents, for, the fact that we don't learn this in our formal education is really silly, right? It's really setting our society up to fail, right? Because we have this lack of understanding about the way in which we interact with other humans, and what other humans are carrying around with them into every interaction. Your brain is, it's such a great example. Your brain goes into that college professor's office and goes, whoa, we've been here before. This is not like, wait, hold on. And that makes you, to that college professor, defensive. That makes you even just not remember to ask the question you wanted to ask, right? Because you can't access your cortex in the same way, right? Your brain, your access to your cortex actually shrinks down when the stress response, when the lower parts of the brains are more activated. I think of it as, you can't do calculus when you're standing in the middle of a freeway, right? Because your brain says, we don't need to do calculus right now. We need to make sure that we don't get hit by a car. And then if you're standing in the freeway and on a freeway all the time, then your brain actually starts to think you're never going to need calculus. Not just that you're not going to need it now, you're never going to need it. And it starts to restrict your access to be able to do calculus all the time, because it won't be as important as being able to protect yourselves from the car. So this idea that the templates that we create, our brain is built on the architecture of experiences, that these experiences will continue to, everything that comes in and out of your brain will go through the lens of these experiences, is a huge part of every interaction we have with every other human all the time. And that goes back to this idea of, if generally your templates are, the world is a good place, people are safe, generally I'm well regulated and well cared for, that makes a much easier way to go through the world than it is if they're not. And then that speaks to intergenerational trauma, that speaks to being a minority in a majority group, and the way in which your brain is trying to protect yourself in those situations, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
All right, that's it for this episode. Thanks again to Dr. Perry and Megan Bartlett. They are very, very busy people. Be sure to check out the Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport, chjs.org. That's the nonprofit organization that Megan works for. They really want to hear your stories, your challenges, where you've had success in impacting lives and where you've struggled. So please reach out there, as well as check out neurosequential.com to get more information about development and education so that you can learn more about it, essentially. You can also follow both Megan and Dr. Perry on Twitter. All their details and all their information are in the notes to this episode. Yes, we have the notes for you. They're free. You just need to subscribe at tocculture.com to our newsletter, and we'll send over every Thursday the notes to each episode.